The bells had not even finished ringing when Evelyn Ashworth pressed her hand against her side and bit back a gasp of pain. No one saw it. No one was meant to see it. Today was her wedding day, and nothing, not even the sharp ache spreading beneath her ribs, was going to stop her from walking down that aisle. The great house of Ashworth Hall stood dressed in white ribbons and pale roses, every window glowing with candlelight, every hallway filled with the hurried footsteps of maids carrying trays of flowers and folded linens. Somewhere below, a string quartet tuned their instruments, filling the morning air with soft, uncertain notes. It should have been the happiest day of Evelyn's life. She had waited 2 years for this moment, ever since Duke Alistair Renwick had first asked for her hand beneath the old oak tree at the edge of her father's land. But happiness was not what Evelyn felt as she stood before the tall mirror in her dressing room. Her reflection looked pale, almost ghostly, against the ivory silk of her gown. Her lips were dry. Her hands trembled as she reached for her veil. A thin line of sweat traced her temple, though the morning was cool. "Nerves, my lady," said Constance, the young maid helping her dress, noticing the slight shake in Evelyn's fingers. "Every bride feels this way. My own sister could not stop shaking on her wedding morning, and by evening, she was laughing so hard she cried." Evelyn tried to smile. "Yes," she said softly, "just nerves." But it was not nerves. It was something far more serious, something she had been hiding for 3 days, wrapped tightly beneath her gown, where no one could see it. A wound. A deep, aching wound that refused to heal, that throbbed with every step she took, every breath she drew. She had told no one, not her mother, not her maids, not even the man she was about to marry. She could still remember the night it happened, 3 days before the wedding, when she had gone out alone to walk along the garden path behind the old stone wall. The memory came to her now in broken pieces, disjointed and terrifying, like shards of glass she could not quite fit together. A shadow, a voice she almost recognized but could not place, a sudden, sharp pain that made her cry out before everything went dark. When she woke, she was lying near the fountain, her side burning with pain, her dress torn and stained. She had crawled back to the house in the darkness, terrified and shaking, and told the first person she saw, her old nursemaid, Mrs. Fenwick, that she had fallen. Mrs. Fenwick, who had raised Evelyn since she was a child, had looked at the wound with wide, frightened eyes, and known immediately that this was no simple fall. But before she could say another word, a note had arrived, a note with no signature, only a single warning, written in careful, cold handwriting. "Tell no one, or the wedding will never happen, and worse will follow." Evelyn had believed the threat completely. She had spent every hour since binding her own wound as best she could, hiding the pain behind smiles and soft laughter, determined that nothing would stop her wedding to Alistair. She loved him. She had loved him since she was 17 years old, watching him ride across her father's fields with a confidence that made her heart skip. She would not let fear take this day from her. "My lady, you look pale," Constance said again, tying the final ribbon at the back of Evelyn's gown. "Shall I fetch you some water?" "No," Evelyn said quickly. "I am well, truly." But her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, pressed harder against her side, and for a moment the pain was so sharp that her vision blurred at the edges. Downstairs, Duke Alistair Renwick stood in the grand hall, adjusting the cuffs of his formal coat, while his valet fussed over the fit of his jacket. Alistair was a tall man, with dark hair and steady gray eyes, the kind of man who noticed things others missed. The flicker of hesitation in a servant's voice, the smallest change in the weather, the subtle shift in a person's posture that revealed more than words ever could. It was this quality, sharp and quiet, that had made him such a respected figure among the nobility, and it was this same quality that was about to serve him in ways he could not yet imagine. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," his valet, Harold, said, brushing invisible dust from Alistair's shoulder. "Wedding day jitters, perhaps?" Alistair almost laughed. "I do not get jitters, Harold." "Everyone gets jitters," Harold replied with a knowing smile. "Even dukes." Alistair said nothing, but something did feel different this morning. He could not name it. It was not fear, not exactly. It was more like a small, quiet unease sitting at the back of his mind, the kind of feeling he got right before a storm arrived, when the air grew still and heavy, and something in his bones simply knew that change was coming. He dismissed the thought as nothing more than the natural weight of the day. Marriage was a serious thing, after all, even for a man who loved his bride as deeply as he loved Evelyn. Outside, guests had already begun arriving in fine carriages, their laughter and chatter drifting through the open windows of the hall. Lords and ladies from every corner of the county had come to witness the union of the Ashworth family and the Renwick title, a match that everyone agreed was both practical and, more rare, truly built on affection. Evelyn's father, Lord Ashworth, greeted each guest with pride swelling in his chest, unaware of the storm quietly gathering behind his daughter's calm expression. In her dressing room, Evelyn's mother arrived, her eyes glistening with happy tears. "My darling girl," she said, taking Evelyn's hands in her own. "You look like a dream." Evelyn forced a bright smile, though the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her side. "Thank you, Mother." Her mother studied her for a moment, her expression softening with concern. "You are trembling." "It is only excitement," Evelyn said quickly. "I promise you, Mother, I am simply overwhelmed with joy." Her mother smiled, satisfied, and pressed a gentle kiss to Evelyn's forehead before hurrying off to attend to the final preparations. Evelyn exhaled slowly once she was alone again, closing her eyes and steadying herself against the edge of the dressing table. She could do this. She had to do this. In just a few hours, she would be married, safe under the protection of a powerful and loving husband, and whatever danger had followed her these past few days would surely fade into the past. Or so she hoped. Mrs. Fenwick appeared in the doorway then, her face lined with worry she tried desperately to hide. She had known Evelyn since the girl was born, had rocked her to sleep as an infant, had bandaged her scraped knees as a child, and now, watching her prepare to walk toward an uncertain future, Mrs. Fenwick felt a fear so deep it settled like stone in her chest. "My lady," she whispered, stepping closer once Constance had left the room to fetch fresh flowers. "How are you feeling? Truly?" Evelyn's carefully maintained composure cracked, just slightly, at the sound of the one person who knew her secret. "It hurts, Fenwick," she admitted quietly. "More than I let anyone see." "You must tell someone," Mrs. Fenwick urged, glancing nervously toward the door. "The Duke would protect you. He would understand." "No," Evelyn said firmly, shaking her head. "You know what the note said. If I speak of this to anyone, if the wedding does not happen exactly as planned, something terrible will follow. I cannot risk it. Not today. Not ever." Mrs. Fenwick's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "Then let me at least look at the wound again before the ceremony." "Please, my lady." Evelyn hesitated, glancing at the clock on the mantel. There was still time before she needed to descend the stairs. She nodded, and Mrs. Fenwick carefully helped her lift the edge of her gown just enough to check the bandage wrapped tightly around her side. What she saw made her breath catch. The white cloth, which had been changed only that morning, was already soaked through with a dark red stain, spreading wider than it had any right to. "My lady," Mrs. Fenwick whispered, horror creeping into her voice. "This is not healing. This is getting worse." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice shaking now despite her best efforts to remain calm. "But I cannot stop. I cannot let anyone see. Please, Fenwick, help me change the bandage quickly, before anyone else comes." With trembling hands, Mrs. Fenwick worked quickly, replacing the soaked cloth with a fresh one, wrapping it as tightly as she dared, without causing Evelyn more pain. Neither woman spoke as they worked, both aware that time was slipping away, both terrified of what might happen if the truth were revealed before the ceremony could take place. When the new bandage was secured, and Evelyn's gown was carefully arranged to hide any trace of what lay beneath, Mrs. Fenwick took her hand and held it tightly. "You are the bravest girl I have ever known," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But bravery should not mean silence." "Not always." Evelyn squeezed her hand in return. "After today," she promised, "after I am safely married, I will tell Alistair everything. I swear it. I only need to get through this one day." Mrs. Fenwick did not look convinced, but she said nothing more. There was no time left for argument. Downstairs, the music had begun to swell, signaling that the ceremony was about to start. Evelyn's father appeared in the doorway, beaming with pride, ready to walk his daughter down the aisle. "Are you ready, my dear?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. Evelyn took one last steadying breath, forcing her spine straight despite the pain screaming through her side. and lifted her chin with the same quiet determination that had carried the Ashworth family through generations of hardship and triumph alike. "Yes, father," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I am ready." She took his arm, and together they made their way toward the grand staircase, toward the guests waiting below, toward the man she loved, standing at the altar, with no idea of the danger that had followed his bride, all the way to her wedding day. Behind them, Mrs. Fenwick watched with her heart pounding, praying silently that Evelyn would make it through the ceremony before anyone else noticed what she had already seen, the unmistakable, spreading stain of blood that no amount of careful dressing could fully hide forever. As Evelyn descended the stairs, each step sent a fresh wave of pain through her body, but she kept her expression calm, her smile bright, her posture perfect. The guests below gasped at her beauty, whispering to one another about how radiant she looked, how lucky the Duke was to have found such a woman. None of them noticed the slight tremor in her hands. None of them noticed how carefully she held herself, how she avoided any sudden movement that might disturb the wound hidden beneath her gown. Only one person, standing at the front of the hall beside the altar, watched her approach with a growing sense of unease that he could not quite explain. Duke Alistair Renwick's sharp gray eyes studied his bride as she moved toward him, and something deep within him, some instinct honed by years of reading people and situations others overlooked, told him that something was terribly wrong. He did not yet know what it was, but he intended to find out. The music swelled louder as Evelyn reached the bottom of the staircase, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the ceremony about to unfold. No one in that room, save for one frightened old nursemaid standing quietly near the back, understood the true weight of what was happening. No one understood that beneath the joy and celebration, a young woman was fighting through pain and fear simply to reach the altar, driven by love, loyalty, and a desperate hope that everything would somehow be all right once the vows were spoken, and the danger, whatever it was, would finally be behind her. As Lord Ashworth placed his daughter's hand into the Duke's waiting palm, Alistair felt something that made his chest tighten with alarm. Her fingers, wrapped in delicate white lace gloves, were ice-cold and trembling, far more than any simple case of nerves could explain. He looked into her eyes, searching for answers, and saw something flicker there. Fear, quickly masked, but unmistakable to a man trained to notice even the smallest details others missed entirely. The ceremony was about to begin, and neither Evelyn nor Alistair yet understood how quickly everything was about to change, how the secret she carried would soon become impossible to hide, and how the truth, once revealed, would set into motion events far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined on what was meant to be the happiest morning of their lives. 3 days earlier, before the wedding invitations had even finished being delivered to the final guests, Evelyn had slipped out of the house alone in the fading light of evening, seeking a few quiet moments away from the noise of preparations. She loved the garden behind the old stone wall, a hidden corner of the estate, where wild roses grew thick along a crumbling path, where the world felt still and private and entirely her own. She had walked this path 100 times before, always alone, always safe. The gardeners rarely came this far, and the family kept the space untouched, a small wilderness within the otherwise perfectly ordered grounds of Ashworth Hall. Evelyn had gone there that evening simply to breathe, to steady her racing thoughts before the whirlwind of wedding preparations swallowed the last of her quiet days as an unmarried woman. The air had smelled of roses and damp earth, and the last light of the sun had cast long golden shadows across the stone wall. She remembered pausing near the old fountain, running her fingers along its cool, weathered edge, thinking of nothing more troubling than which flowers should be arranged for the reception table. Then she had heard footsteps. At first she assumed it was one of the gardeners, perhaps finishing some late evening task, and she had turned with a polite greeting ready on her lips. But the figure that emerged from the shadows near the wall was not a gardener. It moved differently, deliberately, with a purpose that made the hair on the back of Evelyn's neck rise before she even understood why. She had opened her mouth to ask who was there, but before she could speak, everything had happened so quickly that the memory now existed in her mind, only as broken fragments, impossible to fully piece together. A sudden movement, a sharp, searing pain along her side that stole the breath from her lungs. A voice, low and urgent, saying words she could not clearly recall, though something about the tone had felt disturbingly familiar, as though she should have recognized it, but could not quite place from where. She remembered falling. She remembered the cold stone of the fountain's edge against her cheek. She remembered darkness closing in around her vision, like curtains being drawn shut, and then nothing at all until she woke sometime later, alone in the deepening night, her side burning with pain, and her gown torn and stained in ways she did not want to examine too closely. Somehow, she had found the strength to crawl back toward the house, dragging herself along the garden path with shaking arms, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. She remembered praying, silently and desperately, that she would make it back before anyone noticed her absence, that she could find help without anyone learning what had truly happened. It was Mrs. Fenwick who had found her first, slipping out to the garden to search for Evelyn after noticing she had been gone far longer than expected. The old nursemaid's scream of alarm still echoed in Evelyn's memory, followed by the frantic rush of getting her back inside, up the servants' stairs, and into her private chamber before any of the other household staff could see the state she was in. "We must send for a doctor," Mrs. Fenwick had insisted, her hands trembling as she examined the wound by candlelight. "My lady, this is serious. This requires proper attention." "No," Evelyn had said, though her voice had been weak and shaking. "No, doctor. No one can know about this. Evelyn, you could die from something like this if it is not properly treated." "Then you must treat it yourself," Evelyn had insisted, gripping the old woman's hand with surprising strength despite her pain. "You have tended wounds before. You know enough to clean it and bind it properly. Please, Fenwick, I am begging you." Mrs. Fenwick had argued, pleaded, and reasoned with her for nearly an hour, but Evelyn had remained firm, terrified beyond reason of what might happen if word of the incident spread before the wedding. It was not until the note arrived the following morning, slipped beneath her chamber door sometime in the early hours while the household slept, that Evelyn's fear had transformed into something closer to genuine terror. The note had been simple, written in plain, cold handwriting, with no signature, and no explanation of who had sent it. It warned her, in unmistakable terms, that speaking of what had happened to anyone, or allowing the wedding to be delayed or cancelled for any reason, would result in consequences far worse than what she had already experienced. It did not explain who was responsible, or why they wished the wedding to proceed, despite having caused her harm just days before. It simply commanded silence, and Evelyn, already frightened and in pain, had been in no position to defy such a clear and chilling threat. She had shown the note to Mrs. Fenwick, who had gone pale reading it, her hands shaking as she held the paper. "This is madness," the old woman had whispered. "Someone attacks you and then demands your silence so the wedding proceeds? What manner of person would do such a thing?" "I do not know," Evelyn had admitted, tears finally slipping down her cheeks as the full weight of her fear settled over her. "But I cannot risk defying this warning, Fenwick. I cannot risk anything happening to my family, or to Alistair, or to anyone I love. I will endure this pain. I will hide it as best I can, and once I am safely married, once the ceremony is complete, and whatever purpose this person had is fulfilled, perhaps the danger will pass." It was a fragile hope, built on assumptions she could not verify, but it was the only path forward that Evelyn could see. She had spent every day since binding her own wound tighter each morning, applying whatever remedies Mrs. Fenwick could gather quietly, without raising suspicion among the other staff, and forcing herself through each wedding preparation with a smile that hid far more than anyone around her could guess. Now, standing at the altar with her hand in Alistair's, Evelyn felt the weight of that secret pressing down on her more heavily than ever before. She had made it this far. She only needed to make it through the ceremony, through the vows, through the celebration that would follow, and then, once they were alone, she would finally tell Alistair everything. The priest began speaking, his voice rich and steady, filling the grand hall with solemn words about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. Evelyn tried to focus on his words, tried to let the familiar rhythm of the ceremony calm her racing heart, but the pain in her side made it difficult to think of anything beyond simply remaining upright. Alistair, still holding her hand, felt every small tremor that passed through her fingers. He glanced at her more than once during the priest's opening remarks, studying the pale color of her skin, the slight unsteadiness in her breathing, the way she seemed to be holding herself with unusual rigidity, as though any sudden movement might cause her genuine harm. Something was wrong. He was certain of it now, though he could not yet name what that something might be. He considered, Briefly, whether he should pause the ceremony, whether he should ask her directly if she was well, but the thought of causing a scene in front of their assembled families and friends, of potentially embarrassing her on what should have been a joyful day, held him back. Instead, he resolved to watch closely, to remain alert, and to speak with her privately the moment an opportunity presented itself. The priest continued through the traditional readings, his voice echoing softly against the high stone walls of the hall. Guests shifted quietly in their seats, some dabbing at happy tears, others exchanging warm smiles with their neighbors. Lord Ashworth stood proudly near the front, his chest swelling with pride as he watched his daughter standing beside the man who would soon become her husband. Evelyn's mother clutched a lace handkerchief, her eyes bright with emotion. None of them noticed what Alistair had already begun to notice. None of them saw the way Evelyn's other hand remained pressed subtly against her side, hidden within the folds of her gown, or the way her breathing had grown shallow and controlled, as though she were carefully managing each breath to avoid triggering fresh waves of pain. Mrs. Fenwick, standing near the back of the hall among the household staff, watched the ceremony with her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She had helped change Evelyn's bandage only an hour before, had seen with her own eyes how quickly the fresh cloth had already begun to darken with blood, and she knew, with a certainty that filled her with dread, that Evelyn could not continue hiding this much longer. The wound was worsening, not healing, and no amount of careful bandaging or brave smiles could change that simple, terrifying fact. She thought about stepping forward, about interrupting the ceremony to demand that someone fetch a doctor immediately, but the memory of Evelyn's desperate plea held her back. She had promised to keep silent, at least until the wedding was complete. She had promised to trust that Evelyn knew what she was doing, even as every instinct in her body screamed that this was a terrible mistake. The priest's voice rose slightly as he reached the exchange of vows, and Evelyn felt her heart begin to race, even faster than before. This was the moment. This was what she had been fighting through the pain to reach. She turned to face Alistair fully, gathering every ounce of strength she possessed, determined to speak her vows clearly and without hesitation, no matter what it cost her. Alistair looked down at her, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, for reasons entirely separate from her physical pain. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent gesture of reassurance, though his own mind remained troubled by everything he had observed since she descended the staircase. "Evelyn Ashworth," the priest said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish him through all the days of your life?" Evelyn opened her mouth to answer, but for one terrifying moment, the pain in her side flared so sharply that her vision blurred, and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. She gripped Alistair's hand tightly, using every remaining ounce of willpower to remain standing, to keep her voice steady, to push through this single moment before allowing herself to collapse under the weight of everything she had been hiding. "I do," she managed to say, her voice trembling, but clear enough for the entire hall to hear. A soft murmur of approval rippled through the guests, and Evelyn's mother pressed her handkerchief to her lips, overcome with emotion. But Alistair had felt something in that moment that troubled him far more than any of the assembled guests could have noticed. He had felt the sudden, violent tremor that passed through Evelyn's entire body as she spoke those two simple words, had seen the flash of genuine pain that crossed her features before she quickly masked it with a trembling smile. Whatever was happening to his bride, it was far more serious than simple wedding nerves, and Alistair resolved, watching her carefully as the priest turned to him to continue the ceremony, that he would not rest until he understood exactly what she was hiding, and why she seemed so desperately determined to hide it from everyone around her, including the man she was about to marry. The priest turned to Alistair, his voice carrying the same solemn weight it had carried moments before, and asked him the same question that had nearly brought Evelyn to her knees. Alistair, however, remained focused entirely on his bride, his answer coming out steady and clear, though his mind was already racing through everything he had witnessed since the ceremony began. "I do," he said, his voice firm and unwavering, and the guests responded with quiet murmurs of approval, unaware of the storm of concern building behind the Duke's composed expression. As the priest continued with the final blessings, Alistair kept Evelyn's hand held gently but firmly in his own, feeling every small tremor that passed through her fingers, noting the way her breathing remained shallow and controlled. He glanced down at her wrist, exposed slightly where her lace glove had shifted during the exchange of vows, and felt his stomach tighten with alarm. There, along the delicate skin of her wrist, was a thin, unmistakable smear of red. It was small, easily missed by anyone not looking closely, but Alistair's sharp eyes caught it immediately. Blood, fresh blood, faint but undeniable, staining the edge of her glove where it met her skin. His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps she had simply scratched herself while dressing. Perhaps it was nothing more than a small accident, easily explained and quickly forgotten. But combined with everything else he had noticed, the pale color of her skin, the careful way she held herself, the flash of genuine pain that had crossed her features during her vows, the small stain of blood seemed far more significant than any simple explanation could account for. He said nothing, not wanting to disrupt the ceremony or cause alarm among the assembled guests, but he made a silent promise to himself that the moment they had a private moment together, he would ask her directly what was happening. He would not allow her to hide behind smiles and reassurances any longer. Something was clearly wrong, and as her husband, it was now his responsibility to protect her from whatever threat she seemed to be facing. The priest completed the final blessing, and a wave of applause and joyful cheers erupted through the hall as he pronounced them husband and wife. Evelyn felt a rush of relief wash over her, mixed uncomfortably with the persistent throbbing pain in her side. She had made it through the ceremony. The vows were spoken, the marriage was official, and surely now, whatever danger had been hanging over her these past few days, would finally begin to fade. Alistair leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering for just a moment longer than the ceremony required, his eyes studying her face closely as he pulled back. "Are you well?" he whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear him over the celebratory noise of the crowd. "I am simply overwhelmed," Evelyn whispered back, forcing a bright smile onto her face, despite the pain screaming through her side. "It has been a long morning." Alistair studied her for a moment longer, his gray eyes searching her expression, with an intensity that made her nervous, though she kept her smile firmly in place. He did not fully believe her answer, but he said nothing more, allowing the moment to pass as the guests surged forward to offer their congratulations, filling the hall with laughter, well wishes, and the joyful chaos that followed every wedding ceremony. Evelyn's mother embraced her tightly, and Evelyn had to bite back a gasp of pain as the pressure against her side sent fresh waves of agony through her body. She kept her smile fixed firmly in place, accepting congratulations from cousins, family friends, and distant relatives she had not seen in years, each embrace and handshake testing the limits of her endurance. Through it all, Mrs. Fenwick watched from the back of the hall with growing dread, her eyes fixed on Evelyn's pale face, on the careful way she moved through the crowd, avoiding anything that might jostle her side too roughly. The old nursemaid knew, better than anyone else present, exactly how serious the situation truly was, and she found herself praying silently that Evelyn would make it through the remainder of the celebration without collapsing entirely. Nearby, standing slightly apart from the main crowd of well-wishers, a young man named Edmund Wallace watched the newly married couple with an expression that seemed, to any casual observer, to be nothing more than polite interest. Edmund was Evelyn's cousin, the son of her mother's late brother, and he had grown up alongside her, close enough in age that they had once been considered playmates during childhood summers spent at Ashworth Hall. In recent years, however, Edmund's circumstances had changed considerably, and not for the better. Rumors had circulated quietly among the family about mounting debts, about poor decisions made in London gambling houses, about a young man whose charm and good breeding had failed to translate into financial stability. Few people paid much attention to these whispers, considering them nothing more than the ordinary struggles of a young gentleman finding his way in the world. But Edmund's expression, as he watched Evelyn accept congratulations from the surrounding crowd, held something colder and more calculating than simple family affection. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that suggested tension rather than celebration. If anyone had been watching him closely, they might have noticed the flicker of something dark crossing his features before he composed himself and stepped forward to offer his own congratulations, his voice warm and pleasant as he embraced his cousin and shook the Duke's hand with practiced ease. "Congratulations, cousin," Edmund said smoothly, pressing a light kiss to Evelyn's cheek. "You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Edmund," Evelyn replied, her smile genuine, despite the pain still throbbing beneath her carefully arranged gown. I am so glad you could be here. Of course, Edmund said, his tone light and easy. I would not have missed it for anything. Alistair, standing beside his new wife, studied Edmund for a moment, with the same sharp attentiveness he had directed toward Evelyn throughout the ceremony. There was nothing overtly suspicious about the young man's behavior, nothing that would raise alarm in any ordinary circumstance, but Alistair had long ago learned to trust his instincts, and something about Edmund's carefully composed expression felt slightly off, though he could not yet articulate exactly why. He filed the observation away, along with everything else he had noticed that morning, resolving to think more carefully about the matter once the immediate demands of the wedding celebration had passed. For now, his primary concern remained Evelyn, and the mystery of what she seemed so determined to hide from everyone around her. As the guests began moving toward the grand dining hall where the wedding feast awaited, Evelyn felt a fresh wave of dizziness wash over her, the pain in her side intensifying with every step she took. She gripped Alistair's arm tightly, using his steady presence to keep herself upright, praying silently that she could simply make it through the feast before allowing herself any rest. Mrs. Fenwick, watching from a discreet distance, felt her heart pounding with fear as she noticed the way Evelyn's steps had become increasingly unsteady, the way color seemed to be draining further from her already pale face. She knew, with growing certainty, that whatever strength Evelyn had been drawing upon to endure the ceremony was quickly running out, and she found herself moving closer, ready to intervene the moment it became absolutely necessary. The wedding feast stretched before them, tables laden with elaborate dishes, wine glasses gleaming under the light of countless candles, and joyful music filling the air as guests took their seats amid laughter and celebration. Evelyn allowed Alistair to guide her toward the head table, her smile remaining fixed in place even as every step sent fresh waves of agony radiating through her body. She did not know how much longer she could continue hiding the truth. She did not know how much longer her body would allow her to maintain the careful facade she had constructed over the past 3 days. But she was determined to try, determined to protect the secret that had already cost her so much pain, at least until she found a private moment to finally reveal everything to the man now sitting beside her as her husband. What Evelyn did not yet realize was how quickly that private moment would arrive, and how dramatically the celebration around them was about to change. The dining hall glittered with candlelight as servants moved gracefully between the long tables, setting down platters of roasted meats, fresh bread, and delicate pastries prepared especially for the occasion. Laughter rose from every corner of the room, mingling with the soft strains of music drifting from the string quartet positioned near the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Evelyn sat beside Alistair at the head table, her plate untouched before her, her stomach far too unsettled to consider eating despite the delicious aromas filling the air. She kept her expression pleasant, nodding along to the conversations happening around her, offering polite responses whenever someone addressed her directly, though her mind remained entirely consumed by the persistent, worsening pain in her side. She could feel the fresh bandage beneath her gown growing damp again, the familiar warmth spreading slowly across her skin in a way that filled her with quiet dread. She had hoped the second bandage would hold longer than the first, but it seemed her body had other plans, the wound refusing to cooperate with her desperate need to simply endure a few more hours. Beside her, Alistair engaged in polite conversation with the guests seated nearest to them, discussing matters of local politics and the upcoming harvest season. His responses thoughtful and measured as always, but beneath his composed exterior, his mind remained sharply focused on his wife, cataloging every small sign of distress she attempted to hide. He noticed how she barely touched her food, how she occasionally pressed her hand against her side when she believed no one was watching, how her breathing had grown increasingly shallow throughout the meal. He noticed, too, how her smile seemed to require more effort with each passing minute, how the light that usually danced in her eyes had dimmed considerably beneath a growing veil of exhaustion. "You have hardly eaten anything," he said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him over the surrounding conversation. "Are you certain you are well?" "I am simply too excited to eat," Evelyn replied, offering him a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Please, do not worry about me. This is a day for celebration." Alistair studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her look away, unable to maintain eye contact while hiding something so significant from him. He wanted to press further, to demand honest answers, but the crowded hall filled with watching guests was hardly the place for such a private conversation. Across the table, Edmund raised his wineglass in a toast, his voice carrying easily through the hall as he offered his congratulations to the newly married couple.
"To my dear cousin Evelyn," he said, his tone warm and pleasant, "and to the Duke, who has won himself the finest bride in the entire county.
May your marriage be long, happy, and blessed with good fortune." Guests raised their glasses in response, murmuring their agreement, and Evelyn forced herself to smile brightly, raising her own glass despite the growing weakness spreading through her limbs. She caught Edmund's eye briefly across the table, and for just a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, something that did not quite match the warmth of his spoken words. But the moment passed quickly, and she dismissed it as nothing more than her own exhausted imagination playing tricks on her. As the feast continued, servants began circulating with trays of sweet desserts, and the string quartet shifted into livelier music, signaling the approach of the evening's dancing. Evelyn knew she was expected to lead the first dance with Alistair, a tradition she had looked forward to for months, imagining herself gliding gracefully across the floor in his arms. Now, however, the very thought of standing, let alone dancing, filled her with genuine fear. The pain in her side had grown so intense that she found herself gripping the edge of the table beneath the cover of the tablecloth, using every ounce of remaining strength simply to maintain her composed exterior. Mrs. Fenwick, seated among the household staff at a table positioned near the edge of the hall, watched Evelyn with mounting alarm. She had noticed the way the young bride's shoulders had begun to hunch slightly forward, the way her hand kept returning to her side beneath the table, the way her face had grown increasingly pale, despite the warm glow of the surrounding candlelight. She rose from her seat quietly, making her way toward the head table, under the guise of checking whether additional refreshments were needed, hoping to catch Evelyn's attention and perhaps convince her to step away for a few moments of rest before the dancing began. But before Mrs. Fenwick could reach her, the musicians finished their current piece, and Lord Ashworth rose to his feet, clapping his hands together to gain the attention of the assembled guests. "It is time," he announced joyfully, "for the newly married couple to share their first dance as husband and wife." The hall erupted in enthusiastic applause, guests shifting in their seats to gain a better view of the dance floor, cleared at the center of the room. Alistair rose smoothly, extending his hand toward Evelyn with a warm smile, unaware of the battle raging within her as she contemplated whether she possessed the strength to stand at all. She had no choice but to try. Refusing now, in front of the entire assembly, would raise far too many questions, would draw exactly the kind of attention she had spent days desperately trying to avoid. She placed her hand in Alistair's, allowing him to help her rise from her chair, forcing her legs to hold steady despite the dizziness threatening to overwhelm her. The musicians began playing a slow, elegant waltz, and Alistair guided her gently onto the dance floor, his hand settling carefully at her waist as he prepared to lead her through the familiar steps. The moment his hand touched her side, however, even through the layers of her gown, Evelyn could not fully suppress the sharp intake of breath that escaped her lips. Alistair paused, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear him over the music. "You are in pain. I can see it clearly now. Please, tell me what is happening." "I am simply tired," Evelyn insisted, though her voice trembled noticeably. "Please, Alistair, let us dance. Everyone is watching." Reluctantly, he began leading her through the steps of the waltz, moving slowly and carefully, his hand resting as lightly as possible against her waist. Evelyn focused entirely on maintaining her balance, on keeping her expression pleasant, despite the agony radiating through her body with every small movement. The guests watched with delighted smiles, unaware of the silent struggle taking place before their eyes. Halfway through the dance, as Alistair guided her through a gentle turn, Evelyn felt the world suddenly tilt sideways. The music grew distant and muffled, the warm glow of the candlelight blurring into indistinct smears of yellow and orange. Her legs, which had carried her through so much already that day, finally gave way beneath her. Alistair felt her collapse against him, her full weight suddenly falling into his arms as her knees buckled completely. Gasps rippled through the surrounding guests as he quickly caught her, lowering her carefully to the floor, as the music stumbled to a confused, discordant stop. "Evelyn!" he called out, his voice sharp with alarm, cutting through the sudden silence that had fallen over the hall. He knelt beside her, cradling her head gently, his heart pounding with a fear far more intense than anything he had experienced during the entire ceremony. Guests rose from their seats in confusion and concern, murmurs of alarm spreading rapidly through the crowded hall. Lord Ashworth and Evelyn's mother rushed forward, their earlier joy replaced instantly by panic as they saw their daughter lying pale and unconscious on the dance floor. "Someone fetch a doctor immediately," Alistair commanded, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos, though his attention remained entirely fixed on his wife. As he shifted her carefully in his arms, attempting to determine the source of her collapse, his hand brushed against something warm and unmistakably wet along her side. He pulled his hand back instinctively, staring down at his fingers in disbelief. They were stained with fresh, unmistakable blood. The color drained from his face, as understanding crashed over him with terrible clarity. This was not simple exhaustion. This was not ordinary wedding nerves, as everyone around him had assumed all morning. His wife was injured, seriously and dangerously so, and she had been hiding it from everyone, including him, throughout the entire ceremony and celebration. "She is bleeding!" he called out, his voice carrying urgent alarm through the hall. "Someone fetch a physician now, and clear this room immediately." Chaos erupted around them as servants rushed to obey his commands, guests pressing forward with concerned questions, while others hurried to make space for whatever assistance might arrive. Mrs. Fenwick pushed her way through the crowd with surprising speed for a woman her age, her face pale with fear as she reached Evelyn's side. "Your Grace," she said urgently, kneeling beside him, "we must get her to her chamber immediately. I know what has happened. I can help, but we must move quickly and privately." Alistair looked at her sharply, understanding immediately from her tone and expression that this woman knew far more about his wife's condition than anyone else present. "Then help me," he said firmly, gathering Evelyn carefully into his arms as he rose to his feet. "Show me the way." As he carried his unconscious bride from the hall, the celebration transformed instantly into confusion and fear, guests whispering urgently among themselves, wondering what could have possibly happened to cause such a sudden and alarming collapse. Behind them, Mrs. Fenwick hurried to keep pace, her mind racing through everything she needed to explain, knowing that the secret Evelyn had fought so desperately to protect could no longer remain hidden. The truth, whatever it fully entailed, was about to come to light, and Alistair intended to have every answer before the night was through. The private chamber where Evelyn had dressed that morning now became the setting for a scene far more urgent than any bridal preparation. Alistair laid her gently upon the bed, his hands still trembling slightly from the shock of discovering her injury, while Mrs. Fenwick moved quickly to close the door behind them, shutting out the anxious murmurs still drifting up from the hall below. "Explain this to me now," Alistair said, his voice tight with controlled urgency as he turned to face the old nursemaid. "What has happened to my wife?" Mrs. Fenwick hesitated only a moment before answering, understanding that the time for silence had passed entirely. "3 nights ago, my lady went walking alone in the garden behind the old stone wall," she began, her voice shaking as she recounted the story. "She was attacked there, Your Grace. Someone caused her serious harm, though she remembers little of the attack itself, only fragments and shadows. She crawled back to the house alone, and I found her in this very state, injured and frightened beyond anything I have witnessed in all my years serving this family." Alistair's expression darkened with a fury he fought hard to control, understanding that panic would serve no purpose in this moment. "Why was I not told immediately? Why was a physician not summoned that very night?" "Because of this," Mrs. Fenwick said, producing the folded note from where she had kept it hidden within her apron since that terrible morning. "This arrived beneath her door before dawn the following day. Whoever harmed her left this warning, threatening far worse consequences should she speak of the attack to anyone, or should the wedding fail to proceed exactly as planned." Alistair took the note with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the cold, deliberate handwriting that had convinced his bride to endure such suffering in silence. The threat was clear, unmistakable in its intent to control Evelyn's actions through fear alone. "She believed this," he said quietly, understanding now the full weight of what Evelyn had carried throughout the entire ceremony and celebration. "She endured all of this, hiding her pain from everyone, including me. because she feared what might happen if she spoke the truth. "She loves you deeply, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said softly. "She was determined to protect you, and her family, from whatever danger this person represented. She believed that once the wedding was complete, the threat would somehow pass." Alistair looked down at Evelyn's pale, unconscious form, his heart aching with a mixture of fear, tenderness, and rising anger toward whoever had caused her such suffering. "We need a physician immediately," he said firmly, "and we need to examine this wound properly, without delay." Mrs. Fenwick nodded quickly, moving to gather clean cloths and warm water, while Alistair remained beside the bed, gently taking Evelyn's hand in his own. Her skin felt cold and clammy, her breathing shallow but steady, and he found himself murmuring quiet reassurances to her unconscious form, promising that he would protect her, that he would discover the truth behind this attack, and that whoever was responsible would face full accountability for what they had done. A physician arrived within minutes, summoned urgently by the household staff, and Alistair stepped back reluctantly to allow the man space to examine his wife's injury properly. The physician worked quickly and skillfully, cleaning and treating the wound with practiced efficiency, while Mrs. Fenwick assisted, her hands steady despite the fear still evident in her expression. "The wound is serious," the physician said gravely, once he had finished his initial examination, "but it has not affected anything vital. With proper rest and continued care, she should recover fully. However, had she continued without treatment for much longer, the consequences could have been far more severe." Alistair exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding, relief flooding through him at the physician's assessment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Please, do whatever is necessary. Spare no expense, no effort." As the physician continued his careful work, Alistair stepped outside the chamber briefly to address the concerned guests, still gathered anxiously throughout the house, offering reassurance that Evelyn would recover, while providing no additional details about the true nature of what had happened. He returned to the chamber to find Evelyn beginning to stir, her eyes fluttering open slowly, disoriented and weak. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice barely audible, panic flooding her expression as memory returned to her. "You must not know, you cannot know what happened, please, it is too dangerous." "I know everything," he said gently, taking her hand and pressing it against his chest, allowing her to feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "Mrs. Fenwick has told me everything, and I have seen the note myself. You are safe now, Evelyn, I promise you that. Whoever did this to you will answer for their actions, and I will not rest until this danger is fully understood and eliminated." Tears filled Evelyn's eyes, relief and exhaustion overwhelming her simultaneously, as the weight of her secret finally lifted from her shoulders. "I was so frightened," she admitted softly. "I did not know what else to do. I could not risk anyone else being harmed because of me." "You should never have carried this burden alone," Alistair said firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "From this moment forward, we face everything together. Whatever threat remains, whoever is responsible for hurting you, we will discover the truth and ensure your safety completely." Evelyn nodded weakly, exhaustion finally overtaking her as the physician's careful treatment began to ease some of her discomfort. She drifted into a restless sleep, her hand still held securely within Alistair's grip, while he remained beside her, his mind already turning toward the difficult task of investigating exactly who had caused this harm to the woman he loved. Outside the chamber, in the hallway beyond, Mrs. Fenwick lingered quietly, watching through the partially open door as Alistair kept his careful vigil beside Evelyn's sleeping form. She thought of the note again, of the cold, deliberate handwriting, and found herself wondering, with growing unease, who among the many guests currently gathered throughout the house might possess knowledge of, or even direct involvement in, the attack that had nearly cost Evelyn her life. She thought, briefly and uncomfortably, of Edmund's expression during the wedding toast, of the flicker of something dark she had noticed in his eyes when he believed no one was watching. She dismissed the thought quickly, unwilling to accuse a member of the family without proper evidence, but the uneasy feeling remained, settling uncomfortably in the back of her mind as she continued her quiet watch over the sleeping bride and her determined new husband. Downstairs, the wedding celebration had dissolved into quiet, anxious conversation among the remaining guests, many of whom had begun departing once word spread that the bride had been safely attended to and was expected to recover. Lord Ashworth moved among his guests with a composed expression, though his eyes betrayed the deep worry he felt for his daughter, while Evelyn's mother remained seated near the entrance to the private wing of the house, unwilling to leave until she received further news of Evelyn's condition. Edmund Wallace stood near the edge of the emptying hall, a glass of wine held loosely in his hand, watching the departing guests with an expression that revealed little of his true thoughts. When Lord Ashworth approached him briefly to offer a quiet update on Evelyn's condition, Edmund responded with appropriate concern, his voice warm and sympathetic, betraying nothing of whatever thoughts truly occupied his mind. But as the hall continued to empty and the last remaining guests made their way toward their carriages, Edmund slipped quietly toward the side entrance, moving with a purposeful stride that suggested he had somewhere specific he needed to be. He cast a final glance back toward the private wing of the house before disappearing into the evening darkness, his expression unreadable, his true intentions known only to himself. Alistair, remaining faithfully beside his sleeping wife throughout the long evening, had no immediate awareness of Edmund's departure, nor any suspicion yet of the role his bride's cousin might play in the mystery he was determined to unravel. But as the night deepened and Evelyn's breathing grew steadier beneath the careful treatment she had received, Alistair's mind remained sharply focused on a single, unwavering purpose: discovering exactly who had dared to harm the woman he loved, and ensuring they faced full consequences for their actions. The investigation, though it had not yet formally begun, was already taking shape within the Duke's determined mind, and he intended to pursue the truth with the same careful, relentless attention he had applied throughout the entire wedding ceremony, when his sharp instincts had first alerted him that something was terribly wrong. Morning arrived quietly over Ashworth Hall, sunlight filtering softly through the tall windows of the chamber, where Evelyn continued her slow recovery. Alistair had remained by her side throughout the night, dozing occasionally, in a chair pulled close to the bed, refusing to leave her even for a moment, despite the exhaustion weighing heavily upon him. When Evelyn woke fully for the first time since her collapse, she found him watching her with an expression of quiet relief mixed with unwavering determination. "You are awake," he said softly, reaching to gently brush a strand of hair away from her face. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she admitted, her voice still weak, but noticeably stronger than it had been the previous evening. "But better. The pain has eased somewhat." "Good," Alistair said, though his expression remained serious. "The physician believes you will recover fully, provided you rest properly and allow your wound time to heal. But Evelyn, we must discuss what happened. I need to understand everything, from the very beginning." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding that the time for secrecy had finally passed. She recounted the events of that terrible evening in the garden as clearly as her fragmented memory allowed, describing the shadow that had emerged near the stone wall, the brief struggle she could barely recall, the sharp pain that had stolen her consciousness, and the desperate crawl back to the house afterward. "I could not identify who attacked me," she admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "It happened so quickly, and everything felt so disorienting. But there was something about the voice, something familiar, that I could not quite place, even now." Alistair listened carefully, his mind working through every detail she provided, searching for any clue that might help identify the person responsible. "The note," he said, retrieving the folded paper from where he had kept it safely tucked within his coat. "Mrs. Fenwick showed this to me. Do you recognize this handwriting from anywhere?" Evelyn studied the note carefully, her brow furrowing in concentration as she examined the careful, deliberate script. "I do not recognize it specifically," she said slowly, "though something about the way certain letters are formed feels oddly familiar, as though I have seen this style somewhere before, perhaps in personal correspondence rather than formal documents." "We will find whoever is responsible," Alistair said firmly, taking her hand gently in his own. "I intend to speak with every member of the household staff, every guest who attended the wedding, and anyone else who might have information relevant to this attack. Someone knows something, Evelyn. We simply need to uncover it." Over the following days, as Evelyn's physical strength gradually returned under careful medical supervision, Alistair began his quiet, methodical investigation into the events surrounding the attack. He spoke discreetly with members of the household staff, asking careful questions about anything unusual they might have noticed in the days leading up to the wedding, about any strangers seen near the estate grounds, about any tensions or conflicts within the family that might provide motive for such a serious crime. Most of the staff had little useful information to offer, though several mentioned noticing Edmund Wallace behaving somewhat differently than usual in recent weeks, seeming more withdrawn and preoccupied than his typically cheerful demeanor suggested. One young stablehand mentioned overhearing a heated conversation between Edmund and an unfamiliar man near the estate's eastern boundary, though he had not thought much of it at the time, assuming it was simply a private matter unrelated to the family's affairs. Alistair filed this information away carefully, his suspicion regarding Edmund growing steadily, as additional small details began accumulating. He recalled the young man's expression during the wedding toast, the flicker of something dark he had noticed but not fully understood at the time, and found himself wondering whether Edmund's financial difficulties, rumored quietly among the family for months, might provide sufficient motive for such a serious act. He discussed his growing suspicions privately with Mrs. Fenwick, whose loyalty to Evelyn made her a valuable ally in the quiet investigation. "I have heard the same rumors regarding young Master Edmund," she admitted carefully. "Debts accumulated through poor decisions in London, apparently quite significant in scope. Some among the staff have whispered that he stood to inherit a substantial portion of Lady Evelyn's fortune, had the wedding failed to proceed for any reason." This information struck Alistair with sudden, chilling clarity. If Edmund's inheritance depended somehow on the marriage not taking place, then perhaps the attack had never been intended to prevent the wedding entirely, but rather to create circumstances where Evelyn, frightened and injured, might call off the ceremony herself, allowing Edmund to claim whatever inheritance he believed himself entitled to receive. But the note had specifically demanded that the wedding proceed as planned, threatening worse consequences should it be delayed or cancelled. This detail confused Alistair initially, seeming to contradict his emerging theory about Edmund's potential motive. Why would someone hoping to prevent the marriage insist so forcefully that it continue exactly as scheduled? He puzzled over this apparent contradiction for several days, discussing various theories quietly with Evelyn as her strength continued returning, until a possible explanation finally occurred to him. Perhaps the attack itself, and the subsequent threat demanding silence, had never been intended to prevent the wedding at all, but rather to ensure that Evelyn remained too frightened and distracted to properly investigate certain matters, that Edmund needed to remain hidden until after the ceremony was complete. "What matters could those be?" Evelyn asked, sitting propped against pillows in her bed as she regained strength each day, her curiosity and concern growing alongside Alistair's careful investigation. "I do not yet know," Alistair admitted, frustration evident in his voice. "But I intend to find out. Perhaps Edmund required time that your fear and silence provided him, to accomplish something specific before the wedding concluded, and circumstances changed in ways that might interfere with his plans." Determined to uncover the truth, Alistair began investigating Edmund's recent activities more directly, discreetly inquiring among mutual acquaintances in London about the young man's financial situation and recent behavior. What he discovered confirmed his growing suspicions with alarming clarity. Edmund's debts had grown far more severe than even the quiet family rumors suggested, with several concerning individuals in London reportedly demanding immediate repayment through increasingly aggressive means. More troubling still, Alistair learned that Edmund had recently made several visits to a solicitor's office in London, inquiries that, according to a contact willing to share discreet information, concerned matters of inheritance and family trusts connected specifically to the Ashworth family fortune. This detail suggested that Edmund's interest in Evelyn's inheritance extended far beyond simple family curiosity, indicating a deliberate and calculated plan that had likely been developing for weeks or even months before the wedding took place. Armed with this troubling information, Alistair returned to Ashworth Hall with a heavy heart, understanding that he now needed to confront the difficult reality that Evelyn's own cousin, a man she had known and trusted since childhood, appeared to be directly responsible for the attack that had nearly cost her life. He found Evelyn sitting near the window of her chamber, finally strong enough to move about more freely, though still recovering fully from her ordeal. She looked up as he entered, her expression brightening at the sight of him, before quickly turning serious as she noticed the troubled look on his face. "You have discovered something," she said, understanding immediately from his expression that his investigation had revealed disturbing news. "Please, tell me everything." Alistair sat beside her carefully, taking her hand in his own as he began recounting everything he had learned about Edmund's financial troubles, his suspicious inquiries regarding the family inheritance, and the concerning pattern of behavior that suggested a calculated plan rather than simple coincidence. Evelyn listened with growing horror, tears welling in her eyes, as the terrible possibilities settled over her. "Edmund," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "We grew up together. He was like a brother to me. How could he possibly be responsible for something so terrible?" "I understand this is difficult to accept," Alistair said gently, "but the evidence continues pointing in his direction. I believe we must confront him directly, Evelyn. We need to understand the full truth, and we need to ensure that whatever danger he represents is fully addressed before it can cause further harm to you or anyone else in your family." Evelyn nodded slowly, wiping away her tears as determination replaced her initial shock and grief. "Then we must speak with him," she said firmly. "I need to understand why, Alistair. I need to hear the truth directly from him, regardless of how painful that truth might prove to be." Together, they began planning how best to approach Edmund, understanding that a direct confrontation would need to be handled carefully, ensuring that any evidence of wrongdoing could be properly established before Edmund had any opportunity to flee or destroy incriminating information. The investigation that had begun quietly in the days following Evelyn's collapse was now approaching its critical conclusion, and both Alistair and Evelyn understood that the coming confrontation would finally reveal the complete truth behind the attack that had cast such a dark shadow over what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Before confronting Edmund directly, Alistair understood the importance of gathering more concrete evidence that would leave no room for denial or manipulation once the confrontation began. He returned once more to London, this time accompanied by a trusted associate, skilled in matters of financial investigation, determined to trace the full extent of Edmund's dealings before returning to Ashworth Hall for the difficult conversation that awaited. Their investigation led them to a modest solicitor's office tucked away on a quiet London street, where a nervous young clerk, after considerable persuasion and the promise of complete confidentiality, agreed to share certain details regarding recent correspondence handled on Edmund's behalf. The clerk revealed that Edmund had indeed made several inquiries regarding the specific terms of Evelyn's inheritance, particularly focusing on clauses that addressed what might happen to certain family trusts should the intended marriage fail to take place before a specific date outlined in Lord Ashworth's original will. This detail proved especially significant. According to the terms the clerk described, if Evelyn remained unmarried past a certain date, specific provisions within the family trust would shift control of a substantial portion of the inheritance toward the nearest male relative, a position that, in the absence of any direct male heir from Lord Ashworth himself, belonged entirely to Edmund. Alistair felt a cold certainty settle over him as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. Edmund had not been attempting to prevent the marriage outright, understanding correctly that such an obvious attack would draw immediate suspicion toward himself as the primary beneficiary of any failed wedding. Instead, he had devised a far more calculated plan, one that involved frightening Evelyn into silence just long enough to delay certain critical legal filings related to the inheritance, filings that needed to occur before the wedding date in order to fully secure her inheritance rights as a married woman. Further investigation revealed that Edmund had also been secretly negotiating with several concerning individuals in London, men known for lending money at dangerously high rates to desperate borrowers, individuals who had grown increasingly impatient with Edmund's continued failure to repay substantial debts accumulated over recent months. It appeared that Edmund had promised these men repayment contingent upon receiving his expected inheritance, a promise that required Evelyn's marriage to somehow fail or be sufficiently delayed to trigger the alternative inheritance provisions outlined in her father's will. Armed with this damning evidence, including copies of correspondence the clerk reluctantly provided and detailed notes regarding Edmund's suspicious financial dealings, Alistair returned to Ashworth Hall with a heavy heart, understanding the pain this revelation would cause Evelyn, who had trusted her cousin completely throughout their shared childhood. He found her waiting anxiously in the family's private drawing room, her strength largely recovered, though shadows of exhaustion remained visible beneath her eyes. She rose immediately upon seeing him, searching his expression for any indication of what he had discovered. "You have found something conclusive," she said, her voice steady, despite the evident tension in her posture. "I have," Alistair confirmed, settling beside her and carefully laying out the evidence he had gathered, explaining each piece methodically, while Evelyn listened with an expression that shifted gradually, from disbelief to devastating understanding. "He wanted my inheritance," she said quietly. Once Alistair had finished his explanation, he attacked me, threatened me into silence, all to delay legal matters, just long enough that our marriage would somehow fail to secure my inheritance properly, allowing him to claim it instead, through some alternative provision in my father's will. "That appears to be exactly his intention," Alistair confirmed grimly. "Though I suspect he never anticipated you would endure such pain silently for so long, nor that you would ultimately survive both the attack and the subsequent wedding ceremony while carrying such a serious injury." Evelyn sat in stunned silence for several long moments, processing the full weight of her cousin's betrayal. Finally, she looked up at Alistair with fierce determination burning in her eyes. "We must confront him," she said firmly. "I need him to answer for what he has done, not only to me, but to the trust and love our family once shared." Together, they agreed that the confrontation needed to take place carefully, ensuring witnesses were present, and that Edmund had no opportunity to escape or destroy remaining evidence before facing full accountability for his actions. Alistair arranged for the local magistrate to be quietly informed of the situation, along with several trusted family members whose presence would ensure the confrontation proceeded properly, and that justice, once revealed, could be swiftly and appropriately administered. They chose the family's library as the setting for the confrontation, a room Edmund had always associated with comfortable, familiar gatherings, hoping the familiar surroundings might lower his guard sufficiently to prevent any attempt at sudden flight. Once the truth was finally revealed, Lord Ashworth, informed carefully of the situation by his daughter and new son-in-law, agreed reluctantly to the plan, his heart heavy with disappointment and anger toward the nephew he had once considered practically a second son. The following afternoon, Edmund arrived at Ashworth Hall in response to a carefully worded invitation suggesting a family discussion regarding certain inheritance matters that required his input. He entered the library with his usual pleasant smile, though something in his eyes flickered briefly with unease as he noticed the serious expressions worn by everyone gathered within the room. "Cousin," he said warmly, addressing Evelyn first, though his eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in the presence of Lord Ashworth, Alistair, and, more troublingly, the local magistrate, seated quietly near the fireplace. "You look remarkably well recovered. I confess, I was quite concerned after hearing of your collapse." "Were you truly concerned, Edmund?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady, despite the emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. "Or were you simply relieved that your plan had not yet been discovered?" Edmund's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, forcing a confused expression onto his features. "I do not understand your meaning, cousin. What plan could you possibly be referring to?" Alistair stepped forward then, laying the gathered evidence carefully upon the table between them, watching Edmund's expression closely as he began methodically explaining everything they had discovered, from the suspicious inquiries regarding the inheritance provisions to the concerning debts owed to dangerous men in London who had grown increasingly desperate for repayment. As Alistair spoke, Edmund's composed expression gradually crumbled, his face growing pale as he realized the extent of what had been uncovered. He attempted several times to interject with denials or alternative explanations, but the accumulated evidence proved simply too overwhelming to counter effectively. "You attacked her," Alistair said finally, his voice low and controlled despite the anger evident beneath his measured tone. "You caused serious harm to your own cousin, threatened her into silence, all in pursuit of an inheritance you believed yourself entitled to receive through whatever manipulation of legal provisions you could devise." Edmund's composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of the accusation and the evidence supporting it. "You do not understand the pressure I have faced," he said, his voice breaking with a mixture of shame and desperation. "The debts, the men demanding repayment, the constant threats against my own safety, should I fail to satisfy their demands. I never intended for things to progress so far. I only meant to frighten her briefly, to create enough delay to secure what I believed was rightfully mine, given the circumstances of our family's history." "Rightfully yours?" Lord Ashworth interjected sharply, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "You nearly cost my daughter her life, Edmund. Whatever financial difficulties you faced, nothing could possibly justify such a betrayal of trust and family loyalty." Edmund seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his uncle's anger. Understanding finally, the full magnitude of what his desperate actions had caused. "I am sorry," he whispered, though the words felt hollow, given the severity of harm he had caused. "I never meant for it to become this serious. I was simply so frightened of what those men might do if I failed to repay them." The magistrate rose then, stepping forward to formally address the situation, explaining to Edmund the serious legal consequences he now faced, given the overwhelming evidence presented against him. Edmund offered little resistance as the magistrate outlined the process that would follow, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by resigned acceptance of the consequences awaiting him. As Edmund was escorted from the library under the magistrate's careful supervision, Evelyn remained seated quietly, processing the complicated mixture of relief, grief, and lingering disbelief that came with finally understanding the complete truth behind her ordeal. Alistair moved to sit beside her, taking her hand gently in his own, offering silent comfort as she absorbed the full weight of her cousin's betrayal. "It is over now," he said softly. "Whatever danger remained has finally been addressed. You are safe, Evelyn, completely and permanently safe." Evelyn nodded slowly, tears finally slipping down her cheeks as the tension she had carried for so many days began, at last, to fully release. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for protecting me, for uncovering the truth, even when it meant confronting someone I once considered family." Lord Ashworth, watching his daughter and son-in-law together, felt a profound mixture of sorrow over Edmund's betrayal and gratitude toward the man who had proven himself so thoroughly devoted to protecting his daughter. The difficult chapter that had begun on what should have been the happiest day of Evelyn's life was finally reaching its conclusion, though the path toward complete healing and renewed trust still lay ahead of them all. In the weeks that followed Edmund's departure from Ashworth Hall, under the magistrate's careful supervision, the estate gradually returned to a quieter rhythm, though the events of that dramatic wedding day left a lasting mark on everyone who had witnessed them. Evelyn continued her recovery steadily, the physical wound healing cleanly under the physician's continued care, while the deeper wounds of betrayal and fear required considerably more time to fully mend. Alistair remained constantly attentive throughout this period, adjusting his own responsibilities as Duke to ensure he could spend ample time by his wife's side, understanding intuitively that her recovery required not just physical healing, but emotional reassurance as well. He often sat with her in the garden behind the old stone wall, the very location where the attack had originally taken place, gently helping her reclaim the space from the fear that had once overwhelmed it. "I used to love walking here," Evelyn admitted one afternoon, several weeks after Edmund's confrontation, as she and Alistair strolled slowly along the familiar path lined with wild roses. "I want to love it again, not simply endure it out of stubbornness." "We will make new memories here together," Alistair said gently, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "This garden does not need to remain a place of fear. We can transform it, slowly, into something entirely new." True to his word, Alistair arranged for additional gardeners to tend the space more regularly, adding new pathways and fresh plantings that gradually transformed the once hidden corner of the estate into a bright, welcoming extension of the main gardens, rather than an isolated, vulnerable location. Evelyn found herself, in time, genuinely enjoying her walks there once again, the lingering shadows of fear slowly replaced by cherished moments shared with her husband. Mrs. Fenwick remained a constant, comforting presence throughout Evelyn's recovery, her loyalty and quiet wisdom proving invaluable during the difficult weeks of healing. Evelyn often reflected on how differently everything might have unfolded had her old nursemaid not acted with such careful courage during the initial crisis, and she made certain that Mrs. Fenwick understood fully how deeply her devotion was valued and appreciated. Lord Ashworth, meanwhile, struggled considerably with the painful reality of his nephew's betrayal, though he found some measure of comfort in witnessing his daughter's steady recovery and the genuine devotion Alistair demonstrated throughout the ordeal. He spoke with Evelyn at length about Edmund's circumstances, expressing his own regret at not recognizing the signs of his nephew's growing desperation sooner, though Evelyn gently reassured her father that the responsibility for Edmund's terrible choices rested entirely upon Edmund himself, regardless of whatever pressures had driven him toward such a devastating decision. As months passed, Evelyn and Alistair settled into the comfortable rhythms of married life, their bond strengthened rather than diminished by the harrowing experience they had faced together during those first critical days of their union. Alistair often marveled at his wife's remarkable resilience, the quiet strength she had displayed throughout her ordeal, enduring pain and fear, with a determination that continued to inspire his deep admiration and love. Evelyn, in turn, found herself continually grateful for her husband's sharp attentiveness, the very quality that had first alerted him to her hidden suffering during their wedding ceremony. Where others had seen only nerves and excitement, Alistair had recognized something deeper and more troubling, refusing to accept simple explanations when his instincts told him something serious required his attention. Their marriage, forged initially through such unexpected crisis, grew steadily into something remarkably strong and honest, built upon a foundation of complete trust rather than hidden secrets or unspoken fears. Evelyn made a private vow to herself, one she shared eventually with Alistair during a quiet evening spent together before the fireplace of their private chambers, that she would never again attempt to carry such heavy burdens alone, understanding now the profound danger that silence and fear could create, even when driven by love and good intentions. "I understand now," she said softly, resting her head against Alistair's shoulder as they watched the fire crackle warmly before them, "that true strength sometimes means allowing others to help carry our burdens, rather than attempting to bear everything alone out of misplaced fear or pride." "You are the strongest person I know," Alistair replied, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "But you are right, that strength shared between two people who trust each other completely will always prove far more powerful than strength carried entirely alone." As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Ashworth Hall prepared once again for celebration, though this time, the atmosphere carried none of the hidden tension and fear that had shadowed their original wedding day. Evelyn moved through the preparations with genuine joy and excitement, her health fully restored, her spirit renewed through months of healing, supported constantly by her devoted husband and loyal household. On the evening of their anniversary celebration, as guests gathered once again within the grand hall of Ashworth Hall, Evelyn found herself reflecting on how dramatically circumstances had changed since that terrifying wedding day. She thought of Mrs. Fenwick's unwavering support, of her father's steady love, despite the painful betrayal he had endured, and most of all, of Alistair's remarkable devotion, his willingness to pursue difficult truths regardless of the personal cost, simply because he refused to accept anything less than her complete safety and happiness. Standing beside him now, dressed in a gown far lighter and simpler than her original wedding attire, yet somehow far more comfortable given the genuine joy she felt wearing it, Evelyn raised her glass alongside her husband as Lord Ashworth offered a heartfelt toast, celebrating their first year of marriage. "To Evelyn and Alistair," her father said, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the assembled guests, who faced unimaginable challenges during their first days together, yet emerged stronger, more devoted, and more deeply in love than ever before. "May their marriage continue to flourish, built upon the honest foundation of trust and courage they have demonstrated so remarkably throughout this past year." The guests raised their glasses in warm agreement, and Evelyn felt tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes as she looked up at her husband, remembering with clarity how far they had traveled together since that terrifying wedding day, when everyone had mistaken her genuine suffering for simple nerves, until the moment Alistair's sharp instincts had finally uncovered the truth hidden beneath her carefully maintained composure. "To us," Alistair said softly, meeting her gaze with warmth and devotion shining clearly in his gray eyes, "and to every challenge, we will continue facing together, with complete honesty and unwavering trust, for the rest of our lives." Evelyn smiled, genuine and unguarded, as she raised her glass to meet his. The shadows of that difficult wedding day finally and completely transformed into the strong, honest foundation of a marriage built upon courage, devotion, and the hard-won understanding that true love required both partners to face life's challenges together, never alone, and never hidden behind fear or unnecessary secrecy. As the music began once again, filling the grand hall with joyful celebration, Alistair led his wife onto the dance floor, this time with none of the hidden pain or careful concealment that had marked their original wedding dance. Evelyn moved freely and joyfully in his arms, fully healed and completely secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would never again face them in silence, protected always by the steady, devoted love of the husband who had proven, on the very day everyone else had called it simple wedding nerves, that he alone had seen the truth clearly enough to save her life.